My name is Sarah Trower, and I am the president of NSCAD, the student union here at NSCAD. This year has been an exciting moment in the history of Indigenous resistance, and NSCAD wanted to create an opportunity for the NSCAD community to learn more about the I Don't Know More movement and why it's important to all of us. I'm so excited that you guys are all here, and I want to thank everybody for coming today. We have a wonderful group of speakers, and I'm going to briefly introduce them and the topics that we're going to cover. So Kelly Zwicker is going to give us a brief history of colonialism in Nova Scotia in the words of Mi'kmaq scholar Benita Lawrence. Gabe Cougars, who's the Maritimes organizer for the Canadian Federations of Students, is going to talk about post-secondary education for Aboriginal students. Rochelle McKay, who's a student at King's College University and involved with the Aboriginal Centre in Dalhousie, is going to give us a history of the I Don't Know More movement. Sebastian Lavelle, who is here representing Solidarity Halifax, is going to talk about privilege, colonialism, and capitalism. Carla Taunton, who is a professor here at NSCAD, is going to talk about allyship, the history of resistance, and creative resistance. Patty Doyle Bedwell is going to talk about, who is a professor at Dalhousie and director of the Dalhousie Transition Year Program, is going to give us a legal perspective. And Billy Lewis, who is an Indigenous elder, coordinator of the Indigenous Solidarity Movement, is going to give us a little bit of an understanding of the current political environment. And then we're going to have time for discussion and questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to everyone. And before we start, I'm going to have Laura Greer come in and just talk about the new NSCAD Aboriginal Collective. And I wanted to make an announcement that next Wednesday, April 10th in G219, we're going to do a workshop about how to be a good ally. So if you are inspired about the things that you hear today, then that would be a good place to continue the conversation. And that will be with Carla and Aaron Munker, who's a professor at Dalhousie University. So I'm going to bring Laura up for a quick second, and then Kelly's going to come up. Thank you very much.
That's on? Okay, I'm Laura Greer, and I'm working with Jamie Lynn Glode. We just started the Aboriginal Collective for NSCAD. It's the first one in a couple years, but if anyone is interested, please talk to me. I will be having cards out with more information and my email, but we'll be, basically what we do is be able to have a support group for any Aboriginal and minorities for NSCAD, and we really want to be working with the community and the Friendship Center, hopefully, and just having an awesome time. That's probably it.
Hey everyone, my name is Kelly Zwicker. I work for NSCAD as the VP External. I identify primarily with a settler background, and I'm from Nova Scotia. So what I'm reading is text from Benita Lawrence, so I don't take any authorship of any of this. Benita Lawrence, Mi'kmaq, is an associate professor at the School of Social Sciences at Atkinson, where she teaches Indigenous studies. Her research and publications have focused primarily on urban, non-status, and Métis identities, federally unrecognized Aboriginal communities, and Indigenous justice. The following text that I'm going to present is a shortened excerpt from Lawrence's article, Rewriting Histories of the Land, Colonization and Indigenous Resistance in Eastern Canada. Any words like them, us, we, etc. are directly from Lawrence's writing and voice, not mine. Rewriting Histories of the Land, Colonization and Indigenous Resistance in Eastern Canada. Introduction to Colonialism in Canada. Canadian national identity is deeply rooted in the notion of Canada as a vast northern wilderness. In order for Canada to have a viable national identity, Native people have been deliberately denied a voice within national discourses. For Indigenous peoples, telling our histories involves recovering our own stories of the past and asserting theories of knowledge that inform our stories of the past. It also involves documenting processes of colonization from the perspectives of those who experienced it. As a result, there is a need to decolonize the history of Eastern Canada, focusing on Indigenous communities' stories of land theft and dispossession, as well as the resistance that these communities manifested towards colonization. As history is currently written, from outside Indigenous perspectives, we cannot see colonization as colonization. It obscures the processes that enabled colonizers to acquire the land and the policies that were put into place to control the peoples displaced from the land. The perspectives informing this decolonization history highlight Aboriginal communities' experiences of these colonial processes while challenging a number of the myths that are crucial to Canadian nation building, such as the notion that the colonization process was benign and through which Canada maintains its posture of being innocent of racism and genocide. And I'm going to also read a short history of colonization in Mi'kmaq, the Mi'kmaq Nation. Can everyone hear me okay? Cool. The Mi'kmaq Nation was perhaps unique in the way it used Christianity as a source of resistance to colonization in the earliest years of contact with Europeans. Mi'kmaq, the land of friendship, covers present-day Newfoundland, St. Pierre and Miquelon, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Magdalen Islands, and the Gaspé Peninsula. It is the territory of the Mi'kmaq, which means the allied people. The Mi'kmaq Nation became centralized during a 14th century war with the Iroquois Confederacy. Since then, it has been led by the Sante Mawiomi, the Grand Council, and has been divided into 7 regions, each with its sakamas or chiefs. It is part of the Wabanaki Confederacy, which includes the Mi'kmaq, the Abenakis in Quebec, the Maliseets in western New Brunswick, and the Passamaquoddies and Penobscots in New England. The Mi'kmaq people were the first native people in North America to encounter Europeans and were aware of the political implications of contact. The French entered their territory in earnest in the 16th century and had set up small maritime colonies by the early 17th century. Knowledge of the genocide of indigenous peoples in the Caribbean and Mexico by the Spanish reached the Mi'kmaq by the mid-16th century. In response to this information and to the spread of disease that increased with greater contact, the Mi'kmaq avoided the French coastal settlements and consolidated their relationships with other eastern nations of the Wabanaki Confederacy. However, Messamouet, a Mi'kmaq scholar and prophet who had traveled to France and learned of how the Europeans conceptualized law and sovereignty, developed another option known as the Beautiful Trail, which would involve the Mi'kmaq Nation negotiating an alliance with the Holy See in Rome. By building an alliance with the Holy See, the Mi'kmaq Nation sought recognition as a sovereign body among the European nations. In this way, Mi'kmaq could resist the authority of the French crown. In 1610, Grand Chief Member II initiated an alliance with the Holy See by negotiating a concordat that recognized Mi'kmaq as an independent Catholic republic. As a public treaty with the Holy See, the concordat had the force of international law, canon law, and civil law. Its primary effect was to protect the Mi'kmaq from French authority on the ground. Under the concordat and alliance, the Mawiomi maintained a theocracy which synthesized Catholic and Mi'kmaq spirituality and maintained Mi'kmaq independence from the French crown. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia ended the Holy See's rule over European monarchies. The treaty settlement of territorial claims placed some lands under the control of nation states and others under the control of the Holy See. Mi'kmaq Key reverted to Mi'kmaq control and all protections ceased to exist. Unfortunately for the Mi'kmaq, the French were not the only colonial power to invade their world. What the British sought was not furs and missions, but land where they could build colonies for their surplus populations. 19 out of 20 Indigenous people who came into contact with the British succumbed to disease. The British initiated a number of attacks against Indigenous villages, attacks which often escalated into full-scale wars. British slavers scoured the Atlantic coast for Indigenous people who were sold in slave markets all over the world. Indeed, they began raiding Mi'kmaq territory for slaves in the mid-1600s. As the British encroached north from New England to Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq responded with open resistance. From the mid-1650s until the Peace Treaty of 1752, which was reaffirmed in the Treaty of 1761, they waged continuous warfare against the British, fighting land battles and capturing almost 100 British ships. As the long war proceeded and the Mi'kmaq were gradually weakened, the ascendant British developed policies to exterminate the Mi'kmaq. They used a variety of methods, including distributing poisoned food, trading blankets infected with diseases, and waging ongoing military assaults on civilian populations. The British introduced scalping policy as another method of extermination. For 2 decades, the British paid bounty for Mi'kmaq scalps and even imported a group of bounty hunters known as Gorham's Rangers from Massachusetts to depopulate the surviving Mi'kmaq nation. Those who survived this genocide were destitute, left with no food, and without the necessary clothing to keep warm in a cold climate. Many were reduced to begging. Thousands died of starvation and exposure until limited poor relief was implemented on a local basis. Others eked out on a bare existence selling handicrafts, cutting wood for whites, or working as prostitutes, which resulted in outbreaks of venereal disease. Those who struggled to acquire individual land plots were denied title. As a result, it was not uncommon for Mi'kmaq families to engage in the backbreaking labor of clearing and planting a patch of land, only to find that when they returned from fishing, hunting, or gathering excursions, white squatters had taken the land. When the British opened up the region for white settlement, they refused to set aside land for the native peoples. By the early 1800s, the Mi'kmaq population had fallen from an estimated 200,000 to less than 1,500 people. Most whites were predicting that the Mi'kmaq would soon become extinct. During this period, Mi'kmaq leaders continuously petitioned London, finally managing to obtain a handful of small reserves. The Mi'kmaq endured policies that tried to centralize and liquidate the few reserves that had been created, divide their bands, and dissolve their traditional governance. These policies aimed at, in every way, to erase their existence. Since the signing of the 1752 treaty, which brought an end to warfare, the Mi'kmaq have sought to resolve the ongoing land and resource theft with little success. In 1973, the Calder case decision forced the Canadian government to recognize that it had some obligation to deal with land claims. In exploring Mi'kmaq resistance efforts, negotiating a concordat with the Holy See, waging the longest anti-colonial war in North America, surviving policies designed to exterminate them, we see a picture of Native peoples as resourceful and capable of engaging a powerful enemy in armed conflict for a significant period of time. Perhaps even more important, we see the Mi'kmaq people as actors on an international stage, engaging the European powers not only through warfare, but through diplomacy, signing international treaties as a nation among nations. It is impossible to understand contemporary struggles for self-determination without this view of Native peoples as nations among other nations. Today, the spirit that enabled the Mi'kmaq to resist genocide is being manifested in the continuous struggles over the right to fish. It is believed that Canada usurped lands accorded to the Mi'kmaq under the Concordat's international law. By reestablishing communication with the Holy See, the Maui wished to recreate its partnership in ways that enhance the autonomy and spiritual uniqueness of the Mi'kmaq. And that's it.
Hey everyone, can everyone hear me? Okay, good. All right, so my name is Gabe, and I am the Maritimes organizer of the Canadian Federation of Students, which you are all members of, and is the largest student organization in Canada, comprising over 600,000 students from coast to coast. So, we are here today on the heels of Conservative Budget 2013. Yeah. A couple of weeks ago now, Jim Flaherty introduced what on the surface is more of the same, more austerity, often devastating cuts to social programs without really much new spending at all. However, a few new initiatives did manage to sneak in there. Today I'd like to focus on the so-called skills gap that was so heavily emphasized in the budget and point out one of those new initiatives which, as I'll try to explain, is really less of a new initiative and more of an insulting jab at Aboriginal peoples. So, it's called the First Nations Education Act. Wow, you might be thinking. They actually responded to the calls of Aboriginal peoples, and I don't know more. They're actually doing something positive for once. And I'll allow you that brief moment of optimism before I dash all of your hopes. I'm really sorry. Allow me to provide some background to this, to the Act, and in order to do so, briefly talk about how education, specifically post-secondary education, is funded for Aboriginal students. First, and let me be clear about this, the right to education for Aboriginal peoples comes from a series of treaties signed over the course of several decades and recognized in Canada's Constitution. It's the law. There's no getting around it, unless, I guess, you're the government, at any rate. In 1968, Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada, formerly the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, began providing direct funding for First Nations and Inuit students to pursue post-secondary education. From that time until 1992, funding for post-secondary for the Post-Secondary Student Support Program, as it's called, or the PSSP, was determined by the number of eligible students and their expenses. Between 1992 and 1997, the model shifted from a per-student funding model to block funding to be administered by local band councils, i.e. the band council is to distribute funding amongst students. And then, shockingly, in 1996, the program was hit by the wave of austerity that really rattled Canada during the first part of the 90s. The funding for the PSSP was capped at 2% annually. This amount barely keeps up with inflation, doesn't come even close to the often exponential growth of tuition fees, and fails to take into account the growth of Aboriginal populations, which is really quite huge. As a result, the Aboriginal Peoples' Treaty right to education has been hit really hard. Here's the result. Approximately 27,000 Aboriginal students received financial assistance prior to the implementation of the funding cap. By 2006, the number had fallen to just over 22,000. The lack of funding has meant that communities administering the funds must make difficult decisions about who receives funding each year. Between 2006 and 2011, over 18,500 people, potential Aboriginal students, were denied funding, and that's roughly half of those who qualified. Because of the shortfall in funding, priority is often given to shorter college programs to the detriment of those interested in pursuing more expensive professional or graduate programs. Now, according to the Assembly of First Nations, this shameful situation is one that can be corrected. A total of $569 million is required to ensure that no Aboriginal student is denied access to post-secondary education due to financial barriers. And that those students who are funded receive an adequate level of support. As the department, the ministry federally, currently provides $306 million, an additional $263 million would be required. This funding would support a total of approximately 40,000 students across Canada. That's huge. And it's totally doable. In terms of the overall budget, this is a drop in the pond. And one that would do a lot of good for Aboriginal peoples and really Canada as a whole. Talk about addressing not only a so-called skills gap, but also job shortages as well. This would create a lot of jobs in Aboriginal communities. So, let's get to the First Nations Education Act. Does it take a step in the right direction? Addressing this systematic underfunding of Aboriginal education, as I've described? No, not at all. Not even close. Here's the deal with it. It's not really there. It's non-existent. It's like a vague promise to do something sometime in the future, maybe. So it's nothing at all. It doesn't commit any money whatsoever. It's also paired with a provision called Investing in Training for On-Reserve Income Assistance Recipients. For First Nation people now living on reserves and for First Nations people only, income assistance will only be provided if the potential recipient enrolls in some sort of skills building program, as if that's somehow the best way to educate First Nations people. Interesting fact, $20 million is being invested in these so-called skills training programs on reserves. $25 million is being invested in enforcing this mechanism, in ensuring that people go to these skill training things to get their income payments. Anyway, it's workfare, it's blackmail, it's racism. Whatever you want to call it, it's shameful, and it shows that this government still is in need of a little bit of I don't know more. So yeah, that's my spiel.
I'm Anishinaabe from Little Saskatchewan First Nation and my reserves in Kamloops, BC. Just to give myself a bit of an introduction. I Don't Know More was started by... It was started by 4 Indigenous lawyers in Saskatchewan in November at a teach-in, kind of like this one here tonight. These 4 women felt that First Nations and the Canadian public had to be informed about Omnibus Budget Bill C-45. Omnibus Budget Bill drastically weakens environmental protection laws.
So sorry.
It's like slipping around.
This one's really bad.
Want me to-
That one's just as bad.
It's okay. So, Bill C-45 drastically weakens environmental protection laws and makes changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act, renaming it the Navigation Protection Act. Notice that the water part in the title is missing. It's a little suspicious. Now we're only protecting navigation. Under the changes, anything that is built below the water, like a pipeline, is okay as long as it doesn't affect navigation. Even though it could leak or break and have huge effects on the water and the fish, among other animals that use those resources.
There was no consultation with First Nations people before the tabling of Bill C-45. The government has a duty to consult with First Nations on matters of land, rights, and waters. This bill violated treaty rights, which are constitutional. It was a budget implementation bill that made changes to treaty rights, which are constitutional, and it doesn't really belong in a budget bill. Like, I think that if the government were to propose any other kind of constitutional changes in a budget, we'd all. It's just, to make these changes, there has to be a lot more discussion than there was that we'd seen with the Conservative government. And Bill C-45 is only one of the many bills that will affect Natives and Native sovereignty. Under the First Nation Private Ownership Act, land claims that First Nations hold to reserve lands are being converted into private property. This makes it possible for reserve lands to be essentially bought back by the Canadian government for resource development. The voting process that is supposed to prevent this from happening, or in the very least, making it a democratic voting process, was changed. Instead of needing 2 majority votes, only a single majority vote is needed to convert the land claims into private property. This is a serious problem on reserves that have faced in the past corruption problems. Not everyone finds out about band council meetings all the time, and sometimes they can be kept pretty quiet. So basically, a few people can decide for the entire community to surrender their land to the government for a big payout. Idle No More has been a women's-led grassroots movement that demands Indigenous rights to be recognized in consultation with both the government and Native leadership. On December 10th, it was the National Day of Action. At this point, there were Native protests happening all over BC, protesting both the Northern Gateway and Pacific Trails pipelines. And this is when Idle No More Halifax really got started. That's when we had our first protest from the bottom of Spring Garden up to Parade Square. And this day, the National Day of Action, is really what sparked a lot of the protests that happened in the next couple months to come. The day after, on December 11th, Teresa Spence started her hunger strike. She ate only fish broth for 6 months. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Sorry, that was bad. She was demanding a meeting with the Prime Minister and the Government General. During that time, there were lots of protests, flash mobs, and teach-ins. Political grassroots movement. Idle No More started as a political grassroots movement, but has also become a display of First Nations culture and art. There's been Idle No More music videos, as well as traditional arts like beading and regalia making that have been inspired through Idle No More. And we've seen the movement grow a lot in the last 5 months. It's gained international solidarity. There's been protests in Mexico, the US, the UK, Germany, Egypt, and New Zealand, among other countries. And Bill C-45 and C-38 and the First Nations Private Ownership Act, among other legislation, violates the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights in Canada that was signed in 2010. Article 18 under the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights states, Indigenous people have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves. And Article 19 states, states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. So what does Idle No More stand for? Idle No More stands for the implementation of all rights that were in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canada signed, and we stand for environmental protection. First Nations people are the fastest growing population in this country and the only Canadians with a constitutional right to the land and waters. This awakening that we are seeing around the world in Idle No More is a people's demand for change, and this change begins by changing the way that we've treated the earth and changing how we've been living, not following the natural laws that reflect true sharing and respect for all life.
Can everyone hear me? First of all, before I begin, if you haven't already on the way in, there's a couple of handouts on the table there that have kind of a brief timeline, a very brief timeline about landmarks in the colonial history of Mi'kmaq, this part of the continent, and also breakdowns of different bills that have been referred to. Yeah.
When Sarah was introducing everybody, I wasn't sure who everyone was, so would you mind telling us again?
Yeah, I'm just about to do that.
Oh, that's sorry.
No problem. My name is Sebastian Lavelle, and I'm speaking today as a member of Solidarity Halifax. Yes. So, is it? Oh, hear me better now? Solidarity Halifax is one of your friendly neighborhood anti-capitalist organizations here in the city. And more on that later. First, I'd like to explain why Solidarity Halifax supports Idle No More. We support Idle No More because it's an expression of rage. It's an act of defiance expressed in many ways across the continent, against yet another example in the Canadian state's long legacy of colonialism, arrogance, and paternalism towards Indigenous peoples on this continent. Idle No More collectively is a rightful stand against the degradation of territorial rights of Indigenous peoples, against the latest attempt to privatize reserved lands and all commonly held territories, and against the latest example in a long history of efforts to force Indigenous peoples to assimilate into a system of private property, wage labor, and profit accumulation. So we're all gathered here today because I assume most of us see some common ground in a fight against the Harper government and the omnibus budget bills. And this common ground is very important, and it has to give us strength to work together toward a common goal. But there are two things at Solidarity Halifax that we feel must be considered when establishing this common ground. The first of which is that we have to be careful of blurring out white or settler privilege in calls for unity, and recognize how, while we are all affected by these changes, we're affected in different ways and to different extents. Finding common ground has to come with considerations of different circumstances. The most unifying point of concern with the budget bills, for example, is the removal of legislative protection of our natural environment. And that's no surprise. We all need clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, clean soil out of which to grow our food. But in that analysis, we need to consider that Aboriginal and First Nations communities will be affected or will feel the effects much more than others. These communities depend much more than most on the direct use of the natural resources that surround them in order to sustain themselves. And also, polluting extractive industries and waste sites are located much nearer to these communities and in greater numbers than to others. There's also common ground found in the opposition to Stephen Harper's disdain for democracy. However, here too, privilege must come into account. It's important to consider that while Stephen Harper denies a democratic voice to those he claims to represent as Prime Minister of the Canadian state, he outright denies national recognition and rights of sovereignty to the Indigenous peoples of this land, which the Canadian Constitution affirms they have as per treaties signed. So it's also very important to consider that First Nation and Aboriginal communities have had to endure and suffer through centuries of attempts at genocide, assimilation, and forced poverty. And we've heard some of that earlier tonight. And the consequences of this are very apparent in statistics of health indicators, imprisonment, and education. So in other words, while we do stand together, the fields of struggle and the stakes before us are uneven. And those of us at a different and more privileged place need to recognize our advantages and take responsibility in understanding where they come from. And we can't say, well, that's a matter of the past, that was 500 years ago, I can't take responsibility for that. On the contrary, we must take responsibility because this is part of the legacy which continues to shape Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. If we refuse to take responsibility for the continuation of the oppression of Indigenous peoples, we cannot hope to fundamentally change the present, to find true and honest reconciliation. And this regardless of what happens to Stephen Harper or the omnibus bills. And we need to remember that we are all of us, still today, all treaty people. So, my mention about regardless of what happens to Stephen Harper and Bill C-45 brings me to my second point of things to keep in mind when trying to establish common ground. First was privilege, and next is the need to consider the deeper structures out of which Harper and the omnibus bills emerge. While we could have Stephen Harper removed from office and repeal the legislative changes his government has made, and these would be tremendous victories with concrete positive impacts on the lives of us all. But it would still not be enough, because we would still be left, even without Harper and the omnibus bill, we would still be left with a colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. And this would still leave us with an economy that's structured to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few, and where the sustainability of a perpetual drive for profit is given priority over the sustainability and health of our natural environment. So let's take a moment to examine very simply how our economy is structured. We first need money and resources in order to produce something, which, through a sale, will allow us to make more money. This additional money then allows us to produce more, and therefore acquire more money and resources, and so on and so forth. This is the basic cyclic pattern, always expanding, which drives our economy. So what I'd like to examine more closely in the context of Idle No More is where the initial money and resources comes from to begin a capitalist cycle. If money and resources are needed to generate an initial production, then where does this initial capital, money and resources, come from? Today, if you were to start a business from the ground up, you would tap into banks and investors who have already had a chance to accumulate capital, money, and resources over the course of the existence of this economy. But before banks and investors had a chance to accumulate, at the very beginning of the capitalist economy, this money and these resources had to be gotten somehow. And this somehow is through theft and dispossession. In Europe, this happened through the appropriation of land previously managed by peasants. On this continent, this happened through the colonial theft of the lands and resources previously used and considered a common good by the Indigenous peoples. So forward back to today now, where levels of production and consumption have grown so much that the levels of accumulated capital, money, and resources are no longer sufficient to keep driving the economy. So what we're seeing now are two things. One, the increasing dependence on debt and even the sales of debt to keep these cycles going. And two, a whole new round of appropriation of startup capital through the privatization of whatever is not already privatized, including commonly held reserve land. The privatization of this land is in and of itself a goal, dismantling any remaining examples of commonly held land. But what's even more attractive to those seeking capital is that the privatization of this land, along with the removal of the protection of our natural environment through bills like C-45, C-38, and also free trade agreements like CETA, is that through these measures, this creates the conditions to privatize and transport vast amounts of natural resources like oil, wood, minerals, water, to be sold for a continued expansion of the economy. These are resources which, whether on or off reserve, Indigenous peoples have a claim to. So, if it's the economy that drives the continued erosion of the territorial rights of the Indigenous peoples of this continent, when we're talking about anti-colonialism today, are we not inherently talking about anti-capitalism? Can they be otherwise than one and the same in the struggle we face today? My point of view, of course, comes from the fact that I am, and I speak on behalf of an organization that is anti-capitalist. And you may ask yourselves, well, what the heck does that mean? What that means is that we recognize and identify a common root cause for the many forms of oppression, division, and inequality in our society. Because our economy is structured to concentrate ownership and control of the means to produce goods and services, inevitably inequality in wealth and resources occurs and fosters divisions among human beings in order to justify inequality. So this is what we're against. And of course, the question which is always thrown at someone who says they are anti-capitalist is, well, what are you for? I can't pretend, and no one can ask of me, to a single person or a small organization in Halifax to devise an entire plan for a new global society. It's easy to point to capitalism, it's all around us. But to point to something that isn't there quite yet is a lot more difficult. And yet, that is not a reason not to try to work it out collectively. Without doubt, there is more to human potential than what we have now and what's been tried already. We're seeing examples of it in our own community and in other communities of people organizing and pushing through cracks of the status quo. But it's always under pressure and under duress. So what we need to do is give ourselves the opportunity to explore, discuss, experiment building relationships and structures of governance that give true democratic collective power to all those concerned. What we're seeing in Idle No More is a challenge to the status quo. And this challenge is being expressed in various ways and from varying points of view, but there remains a unifying no to the theft and polluting of land for profits that are not distributed evenly. And this challenge is being organized in ways where people are not depending on those claiming to be in charge, but rather taking things into their own hands. Now, as this movement and all our movements evolve, it's important for us to talk through our differences and ensure that our debates on strategies and analysis are constructive and that we don't fall prey to pressures of divisive tactics. This struggle, along with many of our other struggles, will create the conditions for us to imagine another world and to create it together. Thank you.
I don't think I need a mic. Can you guys hear me in the back? I
Yeah.
might end up jumping up. I'll try to stay still. I apologize. I tend to move around a lot. I just want to thank everyone for being here on the panel today. As a new member of the faculty here at NSCAD, it's an honor to have you here, and I hope we can continue building relationships amongst community members and for all of you here as well. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about allyship. I don't have anything written down, but I'm going to kind of speak off some of the points that the other panelists have presented. My name is Carla Taunton, and I'm a professor here at NSCAD. I'm a white settler. I call myself a daughter of colonialism. I'm a colonial daughter, in the words of Métis writer, scholar, an activist, Emma LaRocque. And as a settler, as a white settler in the occupied territories that are now Canada, I take the responsibility in terms of cleaning up the colonial debris. For the past 500 years, Indigenous communities have consistently resisted, have consistently challenged, have celebrated, have continued cultural practice against, despite, at major campaigns of colonization, ethnocide, genocide. And these infrastructures and these institutions and the institution that we are sitting in today, the university structure, can continue and can perpetuate erasures and silences of Indigenous perspectives. So as a settler working in solidarity with Indigenous communities, I take it, it's a responsibility to be able to look to how white society can perpetuate these structures. Look to the notion that we are all, in different ways, implicated in the colonial project. The colonial project that is not in the past, that is continuing today. We have to remember that the past is always present, that we are always informed by both what has happened, but also for what has been forgotten. So within these conversations today, we are practicing a very powerful strategy of the politics of remembrance, that all Indigenous and non-Indigenous community members, individuals in nation states such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States can participate in together to move forward in good ways. A part of allyship that I see in terms of this conversation of treatyship, the fact that we are all treaty people. We all have different responsibilities. We are all accountable to different communities and to each other. And right now, I don't know more, for me, as someone that works with Indigenous artists and community members and survivors of residential schools, is not only a moment of rage, but a moment of hope. A possibility to imagine and celebrate survivance, to celebrate and honor the activists, the community members who have been fighting for 30, 40 years. I have been mentored by these Indigenous leaders. I have watched their work. I can see how tired they are. And it is now time for settlers to step up, to wake up, not to come from a position of shame and guilt, but to be able to honor all of our histories around colonization, around settlement. Look to all of our ancestors, that we can draw strength from there. So again, this idea that Canada, our kind of national project, is a project of amnesia. It's a project so that we don't have to, as white Canadians and as immigrants, we don't have to remember. Well, it's time to remember, and it's time to honor the struggles of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So as this idea that I'm trying to move forward of colonial debris, something that I always like to look to is how do we not know these things, and how do we engage in these conversations? And it's really important. The way I see allyship is a moment to, sometimes you need to step up, and sometimes you need to step back. So grounded in my allyship or my politics around this is an idea of the politics of listening. For a lot of activists that I've worked with, that sometimes who are coming from a settler position, it can be very challenging, as someone that tends to be a leader, to step back and to listen. In terms of being able to actually engage in productive, ethical collaborations between Indigenous and settler communities, there has to be, as we've heard, a recognition of these ongoing colonial power relationships that consistently continue and that undermine potential social change. So as I move into this, where I'm kind of coming from as an art historian and as a curator, what has been going on for the past 30 years in terms of Indigenous art practice is that Indigenous artists have been drawing from the acts of cultural continuance that have been going on, despite the fact that from 1884 to 1951, ceremony, cultural practice, production of cultural material for community, for Indigenous communities was banned. It went underground, it shifted, it changed, some of it went into tourist wares. The artists today are continuing. That's an act of resistance. It's a use of cultural practice, asserting sovereignty, cultural autonomy, agency, resisting stereotypes, challenging the ongoing erasures of Indigenous experience. This is what the artists are doing right now. Whether they're in a gallery, whether they're working in a bead workshop, across this country, across North America, artists are mobilizing the politics that are kind of the thrust of I don't know more. What's been really exciting in terms of what's going on in kind of conversations and collaborations with settler and Indigenous artists is how do we then mobilize together a politics of decolonization within art practice, within creative measures of resistance, which we've been seeing. We've been seeing this idea of how artists, and I like to say this because we're at NSCAD, artists are researchers. artists are creating a decolonized understanding of the history that have happened here. How long do I have to keep going for like 5 hours? So I want to make sure we can. But I just want us to think about, in terms of, if you're interested in knowing more about the contemporary practices of Indigenous artists, what is actually happening is that these practices are to voice, they're to resist, they're to claim, they're to challenge, but they're also really about acts of being. They're also not only about always having to address the colonial project, it's also about celebrating presence, celebrating survival, and celebrating Indigenous, the complexity of Indigenous identities. And I think that's what the power is right now, and I hope that we can see more exhibitions in the city. I hope that there's more indigenizations happening within the galleries, maybe in response to Idle No More, because there's a lot going on in these territories that is not necessarily recognized within our communities. And I think it's time to change. I'm going to stop there.
Hi, I'm Patty Doyle Bedwell, and I am Mi'kmaq from Chapel Island First Nation and from Maine. So I'm kind of these cross-border types. I've been at Dalhousie a hell of a long time, 19 years, and I'm a member of the Mi'kmaq community. I have family everywhere, which really interferes with dating. You really find out who your relatives are when you find someone who's cute and you find out they're your cousin. So I found out I have a lot of family in Nova Scotia. My mother, Harriet Batiste, Battis, as they say, was a residential school survivor, moved from her home in Chapel Island to the U.S., met my dad. They were kind of staring at each other across the street, like he was a fireman and she was a chambermaid, because the residential school did a very good job in training Mi'kmaq women and Aboriginal women to be chambermaids and domestics. So that's the type of jobs that my mother did. But anyway, she met my dad, and they were smoking, because in those days it was cool. And they met each other, and next thing you know, I popped out. My mother thought she grew another appendix and it had to come out, but it was me. And then she had my sister. And so we always grew up, and when I was listening, in between. And I know one of the things I'm supposed to talk about is legal perspective. And the legal perspective, there isn't one monolithic legal perspective from where I sit as a Mi'kmaq woman and a lawyer. I know that one of the things I was teaching in my class when I was teaching, and it just finished yesterday, was about how do we use the International Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or even the Canadian Human Rights System or the Charter, to assert our rights. Our rights are protected under the Constitution, and it gets, after a while, it's like, yes, our existing Aboriginal treaty rights are hereby recognized and affirmed under the Canadian Constitution. It's the supreme law of Canada, but that doesn't operate in practice. Very naively, when I started law school, I asked one of my law professors, who was a white guy, If the charter's in place and everything's supposed to be equal, then why don't we just change all the laws and make it that way? Very dumb question to ask, because it's not a goal. It's not a goal to earn our, it's not a goal to have equality between peoples. It's only if you suffer some injustice that you can hope to make the argument that your rights have been violated. So one of the difficulties I find with the Canadian legal system is I don't fit in it. My stories, my perceptions, my experiences don't fit. So I think about the many law cases that have gone forward to the courts, and I'll just speak about one of them. One of them is, actually two. One was the gender equality case in the early 80s, where Aboriginal women who lost their rights ended up going to the UN and shaming Canada, yay, and they changed the law. So what they did is they tweaked the Indian Act so that Aboriginal women didn't lose their status anymore. The second case that I'm thinking about is the Marshall case in 1999. Oh, there's a third one. The third one is the one that just was heard at the federal court recently that turned all non-status and Métis people into status Indians. And we're like, what? So it's like we're fighting against, that made me think, like, what in God's name are we fighting for? And what I feel like today is that, I loved everybody's talks about Idle No More, and I was saying to my husband when I was sitting over there, it's like, we're always talking about resistance. In a lot of these cases, Marshall case, Sandra Lovelace, have been acts of resistance. And an elder told me one time, sometimes an act of resistance is getting up in the morning. Sometimes an act of resistance is not killing yourself today. And I think that part of it is really, really important to understand, because we're still living in a colonized state. Oh, okay, sorry. We're still living in a colonized state. And with education, I went to be a lawyer, and I did a master's degree in law, and I wrote a thesis on residential schools, tried to put it legal, It wasn't good enough because there was too much of our stories in it. It wasn't just the legal stuff. I was kind of like on page 70 by the time I got to that point. So it wasn't good enough for that purpose. So the thing that I think about today is a very low resistance today. I have to share that with you. And I think part of it is because another person has killed themselves in Eskasoni. We're fighting every day for our survival. And I think about, what if I go to court and I say, I've been discriminated against because I'm an Indian, I'm a woman, I'm old. Okay, I'm not that old, but I feel it today. How are we going to fit those stories into getting a justifiable remedy? So I'm kind of stuck there. I know we have the draft declaration. I mean, I still call it the draft declaration. It's not. It's the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have the Constitution, which is the supreme law of Canada. So why in God's name are we still living or dying under this oppression? This is the question I'm asking myself today. Tonight there's a meeting at Dalhousie. And it's about the issues that are being faced by the African Nova Scotia community. So I had to make a decision. Of course, I had to come here, so that was good. But I had to make a decision because I work with, in my job, so many Aboriginal and African Nova Scotia students who are trying to get through university. So we have these cases that have supported our rights, but we're still fighting. We have a constitution that supports our rights, yet we're still fighting. And with education, we're still fighting. We're still fighting. And today I am tired of fighting. So I think it's really important when we look at the Canadian legal system and the ways that the courts have defined our rights. So we have to understand that that is not always from our perspective. Reserve land is not just about us, it's about the government telling us where we had to go. It's not simply about this was our traditional territory. All of this was our traditional territory. So I'm feeling things right now that are, we're still fighting the fight. And the fight is to survive. And when I hear one more person that killed themselves, like I did yesterday morning, I thought, WTF? Why? Why? And the scary thing is I understand that despair. It's like, what more do we have to do as Mi'kmaq people to have our rights accepted, to have our self-determination accepted? Because it's in your law. It's in the Canadian law. And I feel like I'm right back as a law student. Why don't we just change the law so everyone will be equal? And the law professor looked at me like, you're crazy. And that's what I feel like today. Like, why? Why is it so hard to understand? Why is it so hard to see who we are as Mi'kmaq people? And why is it so hard to understand that the colonialism, the oppression is happening right now? I work at a university. That's like one of the most, places to work. I'm telling you, it is. I've been there for 17 years. And I have tenure. And someone told me, oh my God, now you got a life sentence. Because once you have tenure at a university, no one else wants you. Because you cost them too much money. And that's all what education is about. There was a point to that. Oh. The difficulty, here I am. If somebody had ever told me 20 years ago I'd be complaining about having tenure, I would have told them they were crazy. I didn't even know what tenure was. It was on the Big Bang last night, if anybody watched it. Oh, you guys don't have time to watch TV. I do. Because I'm finished teaching. I just have to mark papers, so I'm waiting for my papers to come in. And so I have a little bit of a break. But one of the things I want to share with you is that I got a letter the other day from the director or the chair, whatever, of a department at Dalhousie telling me that I was not qualified to teach. They found people that were more qualified than me. I'm happy with that. I hope there's more people. I want more people. I'm not the greatest thing since sliced bread, I know that. And that's fine. But the oppressed part of me felt kind of bad. So I thought, we listen to our hearts and our souls and our intuition as we make decisions about our lives. So we think, okay, if there's barriers, and I think this is one of the reasons why so many people feel so oppressed. The legal system is a massive barrier because you have to fit yourself into that little box. You have to find strength. If you complain about racism, somebody's going to think you're crazy. The Human Rights Commission of Nova Scotia will think that you're crazy if you're a Micmac woman that makes a complaint about a guy calling you Kemosabe. They will think you're the one that's crazy, not the guy calling you Kemosabe. So what do we do in that kind of situation? How do we have a legal system that is going to bring remedy and justice? I learned in law school for every wrong there is a remedy. It's not true. Some wrongs never get to the point of being remedied. And I think that's what I'm looking at right now. One of the things I'm really wanting to share with you is that despite the efforts that we make in terms of education, we're always still not quite there. And there was a paper that was written when I was doing my research on residential schools with just my personal issues that I had to deal with. True, but I mean, it didn't mean I couldn't write about them. An elder said, if we become lawyers, we'll still be making axe handles. Because that's what Micmac people did, make axe handles and baskets. I thought, wow. Now, the summer after I graduated from law school, when we were doing beading work and making baskets, I thought, wow, I don't have a job as a lawyer, and I'm making stuff to make money. I am not an artist. That's probably why I didn't make any money. And then Joe Clark said at law school when I was there, okay, he flunked out of law school. I didn't, all right? I just want you to know that. But he said when Mary Ellen Chappelle was speaking about the international rights of Indigenous people in terms of sovereignty and self-determination, equality, assertion of treaty rights, fishing rights, natural resources, sustainability. And she's an international law lawyer, like she's really smart, like she went to Cambridge. And she was asking all these questions, and Joe Clark said, and they were in power at the time, he said to her something along the lines of, is this why we sent you people to law school? I thought, uh-oh. Just because I thought Mary Ellen Chappelle was going to have a major outburst, but she did. Another mentor and sister of mine, Trish Montour, who is also a lawyer, who passed away in November 2010 from cancer. And sometimes I think her cancer was just from all of this. Like, she was fighting all of these fights, and she was the first one on the front lines. As a lawyer, she spoke about the colonial system not being ready for us, not being ready to recognize us as anything more than dumb Indians who are always been a problem. And she said her elder told her, you have to learn the other side. We have to be aware of this, of our laws, the Canadian laws, as well as our laws. As Mi'kmaq people or as Anishinaabe people, we all have our own laws. And I think one of the most important things that I think about is the treaty negotiations that are ongoing right now, which some of the communities, the Mi'kmaq people, have withdrawn from. Due to the forces of Idle No More. I think about our youth. Yes, thank you. Our youth have been so strong in the Idle No More movement, and I am so proud of all of them. And I'm so proud of their, because one of the things that we were trying to figure out when I was 27, where's my voice? And that's what Trish Montour taught me, to find my voice. And you know, the youth, and I'm saying anybody under 40, I should say under 50, no, 60, no. The age keeps going up. I realized one day that I was no longer considered a youth, and I was quite distressed about that. I feel like my mother, when my mother looked in the mirror and she said, I feel so young inside, but there's this old lady looking at me. That's what I feel like, oh my gosh. So I know that I'm no longer 27, and I see these kids, and I'm sorry I'm calling you kids, but I love you all. I'm so proud of what Idle No More has done. There is so much hope. I feel that hope. And I feel the hope of our youth stopping this negotiation process, where we're not going to be just part of another colonial system. So I'm very happy about that, even though I'm kind of upset. I want you to understand that it's hard to live under colonialism, and it's hard to find, you know, that I have to feel guilty about being a capitalist, but I don't want to feel guilty today, but I don't like capitalism. I don't think that's the way that our community should be going. Member 2 First Nation are selling bonds for their community. We become a corporate entity that we can sell bonds on our existence. That's not our way. I work for Dalhousie, so I guess I'm on the government payroll as well at some level. But one of the things I wanted to make sure I said is that I said, like, I'm so proud of the Idle No More youth and the participants, and I faced the colonialism at Dalhousie. You know, Dal isn't unique. Okay, Dal doesn't have this unique ability to be called a colonizer. They're not. You know, you'd like to think they are, but one person that I know of quit Dalhousie today because of their lack of commitment to equity and diversity. But at the same time, they're working on it. But universities work in like glacier time. So it's hard to say what will come of it, except that I know that 30 years ago, we didn't have a Native Education Center. We didn't have the Idle No More youth on the front lawn of Dalhousie. We didn't have drummers opening the orientation. We didn't have the Mi'kmaq flag flying. So those things are such positive moves forward. But I guess that right now, I see the walls more so than I see. And there's nowhere I can go to get a remedy for those walls I see. Despite my legal education, despite my master's in law and my associate professor at Dalhousie with tenure, all those things, it doesn't matter. Because I'm still a Mi'kmaq woman who's facing these walls. And we have to find a way to bring down the walls. Like, I don't have to be the big cheese on campus. I don't want to be. But I want to make sure that those walls are brought down so that people can come to Dalhousie or to any university and feel safe that their experience, their faces, their culture is represented. Why is that so hard? I see Dell and other universities bending over backwards to get people from China. You know, and all of a sudden they can say thank you in Chinese. But you can't get a Mi'kmaq word on the banners. I love Chinese and I'm learning Japanese, so I'm not adverse to those languages. I'm just saying. Racism and colonialism make us invisible. And when we're not invisible, we have to be perfect. If we're not perfect, we're going to be seen as less than again and invisible. And that has got to stop because I don't want to bury any more people. I don't want to see one more Native kid, person feeling so bad and so oppressed and so hurt or so whatever that they want to take their own life. We have to stop it. That's what it comes down to. That's my legal perspective. We need a way to make sure our laws, Mi'kmaq laws, work, and somehow or another, through a true democratic process in this Canadian state, we have to have a voice so that Canada follows their own laws. Simple. And we have to protect our resources and our treaty rights and our fishing rights and our traditional women's roles and our spirituality. We have to protect that. So we, as our role is to pass it on to the next generation. That is my responsibility. That's what my legal perspective is about. I only have 24 more pages of notes, but I will end this by saying resistance is low. I'm tired. So I am so happy that there's youth that are carrying this forward. I'm so happy for the changes that have occurred. And sometimes I get tired of being told, sorry, you're not good enough for me. And I go back to what the elder said. This summer I'll probably start making axe handles. It's not true art, but you know, whatever that is. Or I'm going to write my book. And I'm going to fight to keep my job at Dow as the director of the transition year program. Because I don't necessarily believe that we're not qualified to be there. I think that what we have to learn is cultural negotiation, and that's my job at Dow. So the last thing I want to say is I was accused of favoritism of Native students at Dalhousie, all 8 of them, and or 10, and I don't want to be seen as someone who is not responsible. So I am kind of favoring and taking care of the Aboriginal students when they need it. But I'll do that for everybody because that's what learning and education is about. I will advocate, I will fight, I will stand up. and I will stand in support of Idle No More and the youth that are bringing that forward. That's my legal perspective. Canada has to follow their own laws, and we have to make sure they do that. And we have to find ways to work together so that we can take down these walls of colonialism and racism and sexism. Because we're all humans at the end of the day. Thank you.
Am I on? Am I? Patty knows I'm a storyteller, and I was just trying to figure where do I start with this, right? Because I was listening to everyone, and the most important part of this kind of sharing thing is when we each think of what was said and we pick little things out of it, what everyone said, and find that common denominator, and then say, okay, then where do we go from there? And what do we do with it? I'm glad to see that we've got a thing coming up on allies and working together, because to me, that's what we have to see. Is this whole process it's like a comma, it ain't a period. We still have to go on to continue this discussion and to work together for all the things that everyone has said here. And when I looked at my notes as people were going along, and I tried to think of some common things, and what came to me is partly, I'll probably need to glance at this thing, what came up at the Idle No More teach-in at Dal, when one of the people there, and I've forgotten her name, spoke about something that I remember learning about many years ago, and it was not that it's what you learn. Like when you think of schooling in the orthodox way that Patty and others have spoken of, it's kind of like an accumulative thing. You get this number of initials after your name, then you get that, then you get this. And it's a learning and an addition and a cumulative thing, right? To me, real learning is the exact opposite. It's what you unlearn. We were talking about colonialism, and the woman that spoke at that thing that we were at spoke about unlearning. Yeah. So I think people got to kind of, I'm giving an order here, but kind of get off of automatic pilot and think, okay, I have to learn this and I learned that. And I don't have much formal schooling, and believe me, I've always read and I've always learned. In fact, I tend to quote what Mark Twain said one time when he said, I've never let schooling interfere with my education. And I think that's true. We've got to keep learning all our lives. We're speaking of young and old here. I just had my 78th birthday, and I don't feel that old. But yeah, I didn't know, did you? And anyway, you were way younger than well, I am. But I think of these things that sort of give us a common theme. And another thing that come to me, but like I'd like to leave people in a way with I don't like the kind of things that often happens among oppressed groups when we think about what holds us back and not what we need to go forward. And like when you think of even a term, and I'm not being critical here, Patty, even of a term like legalities, laws, paper will take whatever the hell you writes on it. It don't matter, you can put something in law, but the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I remember going to Ottawa with a banner was a number, the Kairos, the church group that had its funding cut. Paid my way up to Ottawa to join them in this banner thing, right? And what it was is all the churches, all the solidarity groups, everybody made these banners that were 4 foot by 2 foot, and made different things, all the reserves, all the way going right up to Ottawa. And they took these banners, joined them together with Velcro, and we surrounded Parliament Hill, like about 3 rows of it. It was, when we were marching towards the hill, it was over 1 kilometer long, these 4 foot banners. That's how many banners we had. And when we get there, what is it that the government, both Duncan and Harper, said? That the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was, get this, he's still saying the same thing, an aspirational document. Not something that you've got as a right, as a foundation, but something you aspire to in the old Union song, you'll get pie in the sky when you die, you know, like it's a big way off in history kind of thing. And so all I had on my sign was the ism thing down one side, and the medicine wheel with the 4 colors on the other side, and just a little one-liner across the front that said, foundational, little arrow pointing up, not aspirational. Because it was right after Bevo to put that little knot in the thing. And so it seems to me that it's when we assert our rights that we have those rights. And I want to emphasize that we're all talking about how to keep our existing rights, whether we're Indigenous or settler. Ain't nobody ever give you your rights. Everyone historically, right back to the slave days, whatever people got, they fought for, and they damn well earned. And then a few years down the line, someone will come and take credit and say, we gave them their rights. Nobody gave me my rights. The Creator gave it to me the moment that water burst forth, and my mom, born in that home for unwed mothers, gave birth to me. From that day, I had life, and I had, you know, nobody gave me nothing. In fact, my dad, you know, rather cynically used to say, if you're looking for a helping hand, kid, there's only one place you're going to find it, and it's at the end of your arm. Well, I think you got to reach that hand out to everyone else, and we all got to do it together. That's where we get our freedom from, when we assert our rights. Because just like, I think it was Bertrand Russell that said, you have your freedom until you need it. You know, and that's how things have always been. And so if we were going to kick this discussion off now, I hope that we take possession of whatever we believe in and go forward with it and insist on it, no matter what anyone else says, whether it's our neighbors, our friends, our allies, anyone, that we go forward with that outlook. Because it's like, I was sitting like I told you, I'm a storyteller. I was sitting in a prison one time, and this old fella come up to me. It happened to be my birthday. I think it was the 19th or 20th birthday, and I was pissing and moaning and groaning about how tough life was and what have you. And he came up to me, and he had this little cigar box that he'd gone around the tier and collected all these goodies, chocolates and what have you. And he gave me this box of stuff, right? And I'm, like I said, feeling sorry for myself. And he looked at me. It took a few years for this one to sink in, but he handed me this box, and he just had this. He spent his whole life in these institutions, so he sort of smiled, and sort of nodded his head and looked at me, and he said, "Look, kid," he said, "life's like a grindstone. It'll either grind you down or it'll polish you up. It all depends on what you're made of." And like I said, it took a few years for that to sink in, but I really believe that not only nations, but individuals can determine who they are and what they want, and then just go for it. Never mind waiting for the government to give you permission to demonstrate or do whatever. People have to assert their rights. That's the way you get your rights, by asserting them on the ground. The chiefs, we were just talking about a moment ago, was handed a piece of paper that abrogated those rights, and they signed it because that was the only way those poor reserves, and I mean really poor ones, could get the money that this government was going to deign to give them, which was, by the way, is about 1/10 what's required. And so that's what has to happen. Everybody got to stick together and then insist on those rights. And it don't matter either, Patty, you were saying about that border, that little red line, we didn't make that little red line across it. This is Turtle Island, and that's North and South America. The new prophecies talk, or the old prophecies talk about North and South being Turtle Island, and that this is the time right now for the change that's required. And, you know, I'll trot out another quote, Gandhi, be the change that you want to see in the world. And I really think, without looking again at this note and getting myself all confusiated, we need that hope, and we need to have that discussion about where we go from here, from what everyone here has said. You know, let's not let the buggers get you down, you know. Because it really depends on what we do. And I want to end it with one other thing too, is that Rial was 2 or 3 days from being at the end of the noose, right, when they were going to hang him. And he was a poet and an artist. And what he said before they hung him was, and you can dig up the quote, I can't remember it exactly, but I know this is close enough. He said that we will sleep for 100 years, and when we awake, the young artist will give us back our voice. And look at Idle, and look what they do. They go, and we have round dances, and we're going around the mall and dancing. We did it out at the Micmac Mall. We took the name back too, by the way. And we we had that dance, and all it was like, started out with what, I couldn't have been more than a couple dozen of us with the drums, and the whole mall, like it must have been at least a couple hundred people all joined in on the round dance. And then as well, I saw a thing in the APTN News, which, by the way, is the only place you can get any news that tells you what's going on in Indigenous country. You're not going to get it at the Globe and Mail. Anyway, they showed this thing of the actress that's in one of the shows on APTN, one of the ones, I forget her name. She decided her way as an artist that she would respond is to go down on the corner of, in Winnipeg, down on Main and, forget the name of the street. And Main, yep. And she stood there with a sign, because she knew everybody wanted to find out about Idle. What the hell is this Idle? So she stood on the corner there, and she had this sign that says, free hug if you ask me about Idle. And so she was standing there on the corner giving free hugs to everybody as an opportunity to talk about Idle no more. And that kind of creativity is exactly what Riel was talking about, and we have to keep that creativity, that humor, and what you were saying about artists fits so well into that. I have a tremor in my hand now. I can't. I am an artist. I used to carve axes, by the way. Don't you put down axes. And you know, but so now I can't do it like with my hand with the tremor in it when I start writing. You saw when I was holding my pen trying to write. But what I can do is I can take a rug hook, jab it in, jab it up, and do rug hooking, and there's my art. So everyone is an artist. We all have that in us. And I think that creativity is a part of life. You have tension in society. You have, you know, worrying about this, worrying about that. And then when those two tensions come together, a third thing, something new comes into being. So here we have the oppression that we're suffering, Idle No More and other groups, solidarity groups, as a response to that. And out of that will come a new world and a new beginning. And damn it, that's what we got to do.
Thank you guys all so much for being here. It was really great. We have a little bit of time for discussion and questions. Anybody has anything they want to talk about more with our panel of guests that we're so lucky to have here right now?
You all agree?
Could someone talk about the Nova Scotia framework?
Well, to simplify it, it's one of those things that's continually happening around this whole I don't know more thing. Just when we figure, we've got it all figured out, along the government makes a new move, and again we're into a whole can of worms and a whole discussion that has nothing to do with the fundamental issues. So treaties are between two peoples, the Crown and the representing and the indigenous people. It's between two peoples. We're both party to it, as we've said. When no one is unwilling to talk to the provinces, to the municipalities, no one's saying that, and yet this process, this KMK process, makes it appear that that's essential. That if we don't do that, then somehow that's the only way we can assert our treaty rights. Well, that's where the division happens within our community, is that we want to negotiate on a nation-to-nation basis with the person who put their name, the Queen, on that document. Because that document is not just a legal document in the sense that the numbered treaties and other treaties are. Our treaty came into being before Canada existed as a country. Our treaties are peace and friendship treaties. They never ceded land. They never ceded our sovereignty. And sovereignty, by the way, is a key part of it. So when we're sitting there with a begging bowl in our hand, please, Mr. Dexter or whatever, we're not asking for our treaty rights. They're already asserted in those treaties. People could go into the library and bring them up and show me anywhere in those treaties where the things that Harper's doing, he has a right to do or to take away from us. And that's, we don't want to pick a fight with our own people, but those kind of divisions are what get brought into the discussion. Because the real fundamental issue is, what are our treaties and how do we assert those treaties? And some of our people, I don't criticize them for it, want to make sure to keep the connection with the province and what have you. But that doesn't mean that they give up their rights. And I know that in the documents from the KMK, they keep saying nothing in this takes away from our treaty rights. But that's not the way that this government interprets that. They interpret it as consultation, they interpret it as agreement, and they go full steam ahead making laws with no consultation. We demand consultation. We're not asking for it. It's a treaty right. And there's not only no consultation, they look at Bill C-45 and C-38, no consultation. The latest things come out just today. I saw something. What was it? Some new thing that they've done a law with? Oh, the signing those documents to get the money. They never consulted with anybody before they did that. And that's what, hope I'm not going too far adrift, but that's what the Made in Nova Scotia process is about. Because that Made in Nova Scotia process didn't come from us. It came from the government in order to facilitate discussion with the provinces, which we could have had without that.
So their understanding, two questions, Paul, if I may. Their understanding is that it would, not your understanding necessarily, but their understanding is that it would supersede the Peace and Friendship Treaty. And
That was the purpose in that's my opinion personally, but that was the purpose of it, to undermine those existing treaty rights.
So, and then my other question is, and it's provincial, so that it breaks up territory, it breaks up the Mi'kmaq people, right? Because it.
Oh, I didn't even get into that when I was up at Pictou Landing the other day. I didn't even bother asking the question, but it seems to me why Mi'kmaq is four provinces. It's got nothing to do with each province. They've divided Nova Scotia from New Brunswick, they divided New Brunswick from Newfoundland, and Newfoundland from Quebec, all of which have Mi'kmaq and the rest of the people in the Wabanaki Confederacy, by the way. So, you know, it's the old colonial game, divide and conquer.
I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, go ahead.
In one of my jobs, I worked as a legal advisor to the Chapel Island First Nation when the issue of the KMK, called it the Made in Nova Scotia process. The umbrella agreement was really an agreement to start negotiation. It was signed by all the chiefs. So you can find that on the website for the Made in Nova Scotia process for the government. The purpose of the, in my mind and my interpretation, is to bring certainty to treaty rights. Because under section 35.1, it says all existing Aboriginal treaty rights are hereby recognized and affirmed. And there's another clause in there that says that includes modern treaties. So there are modern treaties in Canada. And what they hope to do, what the government hope to do, is to bring certainty. They don't want to keep litigating these issues. So they want to bring certainty. And once they bring certainty to what are hunting rights, what are fishing rights, what are cultural property, what are natural resources, what is our economic development going to look like, or any other issue, because they have all these tables or committees, then they will be, I would like to bring in Judge Judy. Okay. I love Judge Judy. Like, I want to talk like her. I wish I didn't have to. Anyway, she always talks about the four corners of a contract. I always talk about this in my class too. But well, if you want to learn law, just watch TV. But anyway, don't spend any money on law school. So, but one of the things that it will do, in the case law, the courts have said that in order to interpret a treaty properly, once they assume it's a treaty, and then they say it's a sui generis treaty, so it's not a contract, but it's not an international treaty, so they come up with all this stuff, and then they say, okay, let's interpret this right. They will look at all of the elements that led into that particular part of the treaty, like what were the oral negotiations leading up to that, what the capacity under the treaty, etc. That will be gone. It will be based on the four corners of the document. There will be certainty. So you can fish in the Halifax Harbor at between 2 and 4 p.m. from June 1st to June 1st to July 1st or something like that. And we'll be bound by that if our chiefs agree. And honest to God, some of our chiefs don't have a clue. And I have to say that because they don't. Because part of the process in our political world is that chiefs are elected every 2 years. So if you never have time to get used to the job, like who would get used to that job? Then they have to worry about the political aspects of it. Then they have to get reelected and they may not. So there's this constant changing of people who are trying to catch up on stuff that's quite complicated. So I'm just hoping that, well, I did say to the chiefs, why are you using colonial language to discuss our own treaty rights? And don't divide us. We're the Mi'kmaq nation. We're Mi'kmaq. That didn't go over well. which is probably why I'm not working on it. But, I'm a big mouth. But that's part of it. Every person in Nova Scotia is part of this process. And it's a federal, provincial, and Mi'kmaq process.
And I just want to add a PS to that too. We forgot. Oh, sure. We forgot to mention. I'll get the insight. We forgot to mention that when we speak of treaties, there's two different kinds of treaties. There's specific claims, wherein people, the numbered treaties, 11 of them across the country, and then the Douglas Treaty on the West Coast, where people actually sign treaties. And then there's the comprehensive claims, which is all of the North, a big chunk of Quebec, and most of BC, which never signed a treaty. And that's what they call the modern claims, only 2 of which have been signed. And maybe it's more now, but it was 2 that I remember that have been signed in the last 20 years of negotiating modern treaties. I was living in BC, working in the downtown east side when this whole process started. Almost all the chiefs on the West Coast refused to be part of that process. So it was a handful of them that got together and did it. And what the comprehensive claims do is exactly what Patty's speaking of, is when you sign it, I don't know what the Four Corners legal concept is, but it's sort of, you get it on paper, and like, well, it's like what reminded me of, and tell me if I'm off the beam on this, is union negotiations where you sign a contract, say, okay, I want these hours of work, these benefits, and this wage raise, which is the 3 primary things. If it isn't in that contract, you don't have it. And if you don't get it in the contract, you've lost it. That's what comprehensive claims means to me. And that is exactly how traditional people have interpreted this comprehensive claim process. And that's why a heck of a lot of the people in the West, in BC in particular, refuse to be part of that process, because it's just another way of muzzling us and locking us into something. Whereas if you go back to the original wording of the original treaties, they make very clear what peace and friendship is, not ceding land, not ceding rights. And that's what's going on. I think that kind of answers your question too, I hope. And if not, we'll follow it up and find out.
My name is Sherry Picto, and I'm from the Bear River First Nation. I'm a former chief. Signed the umbrella agreement on that goddamn made Nova Scotia process on the understanding that it was agreement in principle. I'm also a DAL student, so needless to say, Patty scared the hell out of me here tonight. I thought I'm going to run away, so I just started going to DAL. I wanted to shed some light on that in the sense that after Marshall had come down, to make a long story short, it's a very complicated process. There was already a tripartite process where the province, the feds, the Mi'kmaq governments were trying to negotiate some common issues. But then when the Marshall came down, natural resources, right? And so basically they came up with this made Nova Scotia process. And it was supposed to be how to implement these treaties. From the get-go, back in wherever, 2000 I would say, we were basically told that this was not comprehensive land claims treaty. You have to understand just what, as Patty was saying, comprehensive land claims treaties, you at the end of it, it's certainty, you give up your Aboriginal title, you give up your land forever and ever and ever. And that's why we didn't want to go into this comprehensive land claims process. Well, because, thank God, for I don't know more, these negotiations have been going on for quite a few years now. Because of I don't know more, and with some our youth, as Patty alluded to, particularly Shelley Young, she's taken a lot of batting right now, battering, and they started asking, well, what is this about? Because there was supposed to be in there a process for consulting the community. And that has not happened. And this is what is happening right now about the Maid of Nova Scotia. And you as Nova Scotians, I would also challenge you to also ask about what is that Maid of Nova Scotia process is about. And so it's under the rhetoric, like what the elder said here earlier, how we have to unlearn. Under the rhetoric of this capitalist, neoliberal type of hegemony, we have certain chiefs saying that, well, you're dividing and conquering, because people are starting to raise questions. And that is the trouble, and that's where Shelley's taken quite a bit of beating, because after her 11-day hunger strike, she cracked a deal with the chiefs. They said they'd have an information process, and they go from community to community, and she's been traveling with them. And it's been really tough on her as a youth to stand up to her leadership. And just like your leadership, our leadership has, not all leaders, all of the leaders, but they have been, I don't know if they're conscious or not, but they've internalized this type of colonialism. And what is happening is that when it comes to major resources, like our fishing, like our hunting, like forestry, and so forth, you see some leadership that really know who they are. They really have Mi'kmaq concepts, they have a responsibility. Then you see other leadership that don't have that responsibility, and all of a sudden you don't know if you're signing off. There's like 100 consultation tables right now in Nova Scotia. Everything from wind farms to the tidal projects to mining. And this is where the gentleman from Solidarity Halifax, I think that we could really get an alliance and start asking questions, because there's been some contradictions in terms of all of a sudden you'll see protests happening against a mining project or whatever it is, and then all of a sudden you find out, well, the chiefs signed off on that. So once they tick that off, then the project's to go ahead. So where are your rights as Nova Scotians? Because this is how the government is doing that. And that's just like a real complicated, I had to say something about that, because it is really a decolonizing. Like when I signed it, I had promised my people that from here on in, nothing else gets signed unless it goes through a referendum. And unfortunately, like as Patty alluded to, is that there's such an inconsistency. And I just wanted to say this and not take up too much time. Those treaties, when I think of my grandmother, I have roots like Patty does, that fought the 1969 white paper policy. For any of you that don't know what that is, look that up, because that's what's being implemented today. Chrétien drew that up. What's so unfortunate, all this money, all this legality, all this struggle, people dying over this. You have to just look at Oka. It won't take long for the government to haul in the military. All of this is based on something that is so, I don't know how to explain it other than my good friend and elder Carrie Prosper would say, you live off the laws of the land, not the other way around. And that's inherent in our culture, and a lot of that we had to relearn. The unfortunate part about going to your colonial courts and winning a right, or winning a right that you should have had all the beginning, it comes down into the interpretation and how that's going to be implemented. And the unfortunate part was that there's been right across this country elders and testimony and oral stories that's gone back generations to some very fundamental principles of the laws of the land. And so, but when we win that, we don't quite seem to get it, how we're going to implement that, and that's where the neoliberal forces. And keep in mind what the Harper government is doing. They're doing internationally. I fought for fishing rights for the last 15 years, and when I'm up there at the FAO, at the International Fisheries Committee, it just saddens me that Canadians don't know what their government is telling the world. And they won't stick up for small-scale, sustainable fisheries. They're going to push modernization. And what do we have right now? We have a modernization policy where they're going to wipe out the last of the last independent fishermen in the Atlantic Canada. So I think this is some of the things I encourage you to ask the questions. We both have to question our leadership and really start organizing. And this is where I've really appreciated Idle No More and leaders such as Patty and Shelley Young for at least bringing this to the forefront. Because people in our communities are shocked, what the hell is going on here? And at least now there's a little bit of accountability or an attempt at that. So thanks, I just wanted to share that with you.
Well, I certainly thank you for what you said, because what should be understood too is that during the fishery struggle there were only 3 bands that stood up for the fishing rights, and that was Bear River, Shubby, and Buttondeck. 3 of them out of the 13 bands, and to this day you can look to those ones being in the forefront, and Frankie's a good friend of mine, so I know
We've got a film about it anytime that you want to
yeah,
watch
there
it.
is. A good film, yeah.
In defense of our treaties, producer right here.
And then when they speak of it too, of I wanted to mention the legalistic thing, when every single decision that's ever come down from the Supreme Court has favored our treaty rights. Every single one of them. But in every one as well, they deke in a back door. Like with the one with the fisheries, it says a right to a moderate livelihood. Can anybody tell me of them putting any moderation on the banks of this country to say they have a right to make a moderate livelihood? You know, you don't hear that term moderate when you're talking about the real power brokers in this society.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, one thing that's come up in this kind of discourse over the last several months that I've been and unable to get really clear on is the KFK, what exactly they are, who they're funded by, who they represent, what the relationship is to the province, to the bands, exactly who they speak for, how it works. I want to know more about the KFK. Can anybody here talk about them? Yeah, but
Go on the Nova Scotia Aboriginal Affairs website, and then the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative has one. And basically it shows the political process and the timeline. It's very complicated, but I should just say what the fear is now is that the admission has been that those negotiations are going on within the land claims sector, but yet it's not a comprehensive land claims agreement, and that's where the contention is. And when you go on it, you'll see like an agreement in principle, and there's like this pattern that they're following. And then if you go on Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, I'm not going to call them Aboriginal Affairs because we still have the Indian Act, but you go down and look at the comprehensive land claims, and it looks very similar. And this is what the youth and I don't know more are contesting. It's a treaty negotiation process, but what we're scared of and what the youth are scared of is that it's actually a comprehensive land claims process.
Right.
And basically at the end of the day, it will cause certainty. There's been if you think of this, look up Russell Dialbo. He's written about this, and they just came out with a results-based management, which is actually happening in international development, where there's just a checklist, and they want certainty, and that's sort of where it is at the end of the day.
And it's on the back of the Solidarity pamphlet, by the way, where to get a hold of Russ Dialbo.
Yeah, but it's provincial, federal, and Mi'kmaq chiefs that sit at this table and they negotiate. That's what it is, and the chiefs have different portfolios.
And when you talk about the money, that came up at the Pictou Landing gathering, and no one could get an answer out of them as to how much money, what it was spent on. All they would say is that it's an ongoing process and it could go on for years.
Eric Shiley come out, one of the lawyers came out in the Chronicle Herald and said 10 million over the last 10 years.
Yeah. And that's not counting what they've got to spend going forward.
All right, well, unfortunately run out of time. I want to thank you guys again